Now that the Overwatch League is truly finished, I think it's about time that we go back and truly evaluate how all 20 teams did in their history. Specifically, I want to look at their biggest high point and where things didn't exactly go according to plan. In this video, I'll give you what is, in my objective opinion, the best and worst seasons by all 20 teams. And by best and worst seasons, I don't necessarily mean their most talented and least talented rosters, but more so what they accomplished or the lack thereof in the case of their worst year. I think you'll get a gist of it pretty fast, so let's just dive straight into it, starting with the Atlanta Reign. For their best season, I'm giving it to 2021. In my opinion, it is objectively a better run than what we saw in 2023. Maybe that's a hot take, but this team didn't choke in the playoffs. They actually made the grand finals, and they weren't even expected to this season. They also ended up tying for the second best record in the league at 11-5. They were consistently competitive against all the top teams in the league, and Pelican and Kai elevated the potential of this team massively, and the rest of the players also showed some great improvement, like with Gator, Hawk, and Masa. And again, this team just felt so magical because the expectations to go to the grand finals were definitely not there. There's just something about the year that was really fun, watching them progress and get better over time and consistently be that dark horse contender. They didn't have the dominance of 2023 Atlanta, but I think that's ultimately part of what makes it so fun. Just the idea of going on that playoff run and consistently having big battles against Dallas, the Shock, the Gladiators, and others just makes it more fun than the very disappointing end in what we saw this year. For Atlanta's worst season, we're going to go back 1 year prior, to the 2020 season. In this one, Atlanta had massive expectations to be a top team. Most people thought they were going to be competing for a championship, and they were commonly placed at the top of power rankings. They still had their 2019 core members, plus some insane upcoming talent from their academy team, as well as from other places, like with Edison getting added to their DPS line. And yet, when push came to shove, when it was time to actually show what they had some severe meta struggles throughout the season, and they couldn't seem to be any of the top teams on top of it all, and it just seemed like they were an absolute pushover compared to what they were supposed to be. 2020 marks the only season where the Atlanta Reign finished below 500, and they were just a massive disappointment compared to what they were supposed to be. Performance-wise, it's arguably when they're at their worst, and just the fact that people were let down as hard as they were makes me think that this really was rock bottom for Atlanta. The Boston Uprising. For their best season, we're going to stick with this year, 2023. Boston definitely saved their best for last. After years of budget rosters and mediocrity, Boston fans finally got the team of their dreams when general manager Pri went all in on a championship-level team. Finally, something that could actually compete in the league. A team that's likable, one that's full of superstars, the best chance they've ever had of competing for a championship. Season 1 maybe had some good moments as well, but it mostly lasted for like 1.5 stages, which obviously doesn't really compare to what we saw this year. With this team, they were always looming as a threat, maybe a step or two behind the top dogs usually, but you just couldn't deny that they had to be taken seriously. At 11-5, they posted their best win percentage of all time. They were clearly a top team in the league, and when it was all said and done, they acted like it with their best finish in the playoffs as well. This Boston team wasn't anything absurd, but compared to what they've been every year before, this was like an unforgettable experience. They were treading new territory as they could root for big-time names like Smurf, Decay, Birdring, and others. It was just a fun time to be a Boston fan, even if they did fall a bit short of their ultimate goal. Looking at Boston's worst season, I think we can all agree that it's most definitely 2020. Sometimes people forget just how awful this team was. If it weren't for the Valiant in Vegas in years that came after them, this could have been like a bottom 3 season of all time. They went 2-19, and their roster the entire time was like a revolving door. Changes everywhere you look, drama as well, not to mention that a large majority of the players were trash. Just to put it into perspective, they were getting blown out by a Titans team consistently that was formed mid-season. The only redeeming qualities of this team were Myungbong, Punk, and occasionally Jerry, as well as the Toilet Bowl. I can't really put into words how horrible they were. I mean, Myungbong carried so hard that I'm convinced this one season accelerated his career. He used up all of his skills in this 1 year. Sometimes I really can't help but feel bad for Boston fans. A lot of the time, things were really rough for you, and this was definitely as worse as it could possibly get. For the Chengdu Hunters, with their best season, it's definitely 2021. I mean, you all knew this one was coming. 21 is literally the only good year Chengdu have ever had in their history, from like a true competitive standpoint. At a respectable 11-5, it was their most dominant season. And coming into this year, Chengdu made some notable upgrades to deepen their roster. With exciting prospects like Monk and Gaga on the roster, the Hunters took a huge step forward, all while keeping their identity the exact same as that fun Pharah ball team. They were a top team in the league this year with multiple deep tournament runs. Not to mention that Leaf won League MVP in one of the greatest individual seasons of all time. The Hunters were all kinds of fun to watch in this season, and they went toe-to-toe with the league's best. I mean, it really is a shame that this core couldn't stick together because they truly were a special group. You know what's not quite that special though? Definitely 2020, aka their worst season. For a while I went back and forth between 20 and 2022, as they are very similar, but I gave the slight edge to the 2020 crew for one simple reason. They were expected to show improvement, unlike the 2022 team that got completely screwed because of budget issues. This year's Chengdu was supposed to get extra help for Winston purposes, and they had just signed Leave, maybe one of the most hyped up prospects in the game's history. And you know what they had to show for all of that? Nothing. Leave in his rookie year was very quiet, and A-Ting, aka their Winston player, was so bad that they benched him for Elsa in a Winston meta. That's a low point that I didn't even know was possible, and if it weren't for a lucky meta shift where they stacked wins at the end of the season, this would have been a complete and utter disaster with no real bright spots to be found. The Dallas Fuel. For their best season, it's just gotta be 2022. Not much to be said. 22 marked the end of the Dallas cycle of misery with a grand finals trophy at the end of it all, as well as a summer showdown trophy and the best record in the league. After all the hype and all the painful shortcomings, Fuel fans were finally rewarded. The Fuel rostered a team of superstars, including an MVP-level campaign by Hanbin, plus the additional signing of Chio to upgrade their main support position. This team went all in on free agency, and the resources expended ended up paying off in the best way possible. The Fuel were dominant for a vast majority of the season, and was probably one of the best seasons of all time. This Fuel team was truly special. What's not so special though is 2018, which I'm classifying as their worst year. This one's a story as old as time. The Envious Core alongside Seagull, XQC, and Custa were seen as a top-level title contender, expected to be in the thick of it for a championship. What we got instead was a 12-28 record with some of the worst drama and mishandling in league history. Everywhere you look, there was problems with this team. Right from the start, they just couldn't figure things out, and it just crumbled from there. You got tank players getting suspended and refusing to play. Burnout everywhere you look. Terrible coaching. Anything that could have went wrong pretty much did. This season was just so terrible. Dallas didn't figure it out until it was way too late. And while it did prove to be a very fun storyline and a good moment for the fans, it proved to be too little too late, and it was ultimately the starting point for a very long and depressing cycle of misery. The Florida Mayhem. It's just gotta be Season 6. It did God's work for their legacy as a team because they really didn't have much beforehand. They were easily one of the least successful franchises of all time, but 2023 was ultimately able to change the narrative. They were a top dog in the league, someone won the MVP award, and of course they won the championship in dominant fashion. They were competitive the entire season and finished just one win behind Atlanta for the top record in the Overwatch League. This Mayhem team was one of the most flexible teams we've ever watched, and they truly were fun from start to finish. And considering the rest of their history, this might be the easiest choice of the whole video. Speaking of the rest of their history, for their worst season, let's go with 2019. My god, the 2019 Mayhem were pitiful. We all knew this team was gonna suck. I mean, they had one of the worst rosters, but somehow things were even worse than expected. The Mayhem had the worst record in the league at 6-22, and only 2 of those wins came when they actually still had hopes of making the playoffs. But off the stage, things might have been even worse. Former GM Barehands was absolutely horrendous at his job. The Mayhem were supposed to be a mixed roster that year. That was the plan. Everybody agreed upon that. But then, out of the blue, when everybody was busy, under everybody's nose, he changed the team to full Korean mid-season, effectively screwing over the likes of McGravy, Apply, and Tavik. The 2019 Mayhem were one of the most crappiest, poorly ran teams in Overwatch League history. The incompetence and the terrible players in unison truly was a sight to behold. The Guangzhou Charge. Their best season is 2020. Damn, this team was a special one. They built upon a good foundation from 1 year prior by holding on to major pieces and picking up Krong, and suddenly, they were off to the races. Once they found their footing and established a lineup they were comfortable with, they'd go on to win 12 of 13 of their next matches from the start of May through the middle of July, and would win the Summer Showdown tournament. And during this whole process, Eileen and Krong became some of the best players in the game and were ultimately put on the MVP ballot. They toppled the very beginning of the Shanghai Dynasty, which is extremely impressive, as their Sig Genji play was very dominant, and it might be their only claim to fame as a genuine threat. Like, it might be the only achievement they've really ever had in League history. This is as good as it gets, Charge fans. I'm sorry. In terms of the worst that it gets, we're gonna go to 2021. It's crazy how much 1 year can change things, from 18-7 to 5-11. Right after their most successful year, they had their least successful. During the offseason, they unfortunately lost out on Shu, Nero, and Chara, and the replacements they made this team regress heavily. Choi Se-wan proved to be a pretty good pickup, but the Charge had major hit scan issues, as Mai K. Lee would end up being one of the biggest busts in League history, and the support issues alongside that with the internal drama made this team an absolute disaster. And ultimately, when doing a retrospective of the Charge, unlike any of their other failed seasons, this was the 1 year where there really wasn't any high point to be found. Just a very sad moment in their existence that everybody would prefer to forget. Looking at their counterparts, the Hangzhou Spark, I'd argue their best season was this one. The Spark do have a very rich history behind them. They have a lot of deep playoff runs and some seriously fun teams, but I'd say their crowning achievement has to be this year. It was their most loaded team for sure, led by Shy, Leave, and Gushwei, and they had some very high expectations to be a good team. And they were able to actually break through those limits and be even better than expected. They were, of course, a good regular season team like they were supposed to be, but then this team was really able to shine in the clutch. The Spark had one of the most exciting playoff runs ever, including a top 3 finish and 2 insane reverse sweeps. And in those matches, it was just so special to watch them as all the main playmakers stepped up alongside the unlikely hero of Monk, who's going to go down as a legend for his Ana play in tournament games. Add in 2 knockout first places in a mid-season madness upset, and basically being the only team from APAC that stood a chance against the West, and you might have one of the most interesting and clutch teams in Overwatch history. As for the worst it got, let's go with 2021. The Spark are one of those franchises that never really had a super ugly year. This season, 2021, was their absolute worst at 7-9. It's the 1 year that they weren't in the playoffs, and maybe one of the only times we truly questioned the direction of the team. And even then, they still weren't that far off. They got some seriously good production out of Shy, but the problem was they didn't have much else. Poor backline play, and the lack of reliable flex DPS would end up hurting them in the long run. They were just a mediocre team. But considering this is the worst they have to offer, I'd say Spark fans had it pretty good. For the Houston Outlaws, their best season is 2023. It took a while for these guys, but this year the Outlaws finally cracked the code. In their best year ever, they assembled a super team with world-class talent. We're talking Fearless, plus maybe the scariest backline to ever exist. Add in a top 3 record in the league, plus a grand finals and a mid-season madness runner-up, and you have one hell of a season. This Outlaws team was in the thick of it right from the start. Everybody stepped up to make a difference. They were all superstars, truly elite, and unlike every other season literally combined, they were contenders. This team had major expectations, and this time, they truly delivered. Where they unfortunately did not deliver, though, is in the 2020 season, aka their worst ever. If you want to talk about a train wreck, look no further than this Outlaws team. The sheer number of pathetic things to go on in this one season is ludicrous. They went 6-15. They lost to Boston, not only in the toilet bowl, but in the playoffs. They had Blase playing Cassidy while Linkser was sick, and then Muma got replaced by Hydration on main tank. All while they were being poorly managed, and Boink was somehow collecting a paycheck on the bench. Dante, Jexay, and Meko were practically the only signs of life the team ever showed. This Outlaws team was a living, breathing meme, and maybe one of the most pathetic, poorly ran teams I have ever seen. The London Spitfire. Their best season is the inaugural season. The 2018 Spitfire had massive expectations with the team they assembled. They were full of champions and other apex talent, and when it was all said and done, everybody thought they were going to be one of the best. So many people expected them to be top 2, top 3 in the league, and they delivered upon those expectations. Prophet, Birdring, Gesture, Fury, and Badoshan made up one of the best cores in the league on the road to a Stage 1 title, and of course, an improbable yet dominant finals run. This is when London peaked as a team. It may not be the team we think about much in the modern day, knowing the culture change and all, but the history is undeniable. They overcame all the challenges that came their way and provided some major entertainment value to the league through their achievements, the only achievements they actually ever had in their long history. They won the league at the peak of its hype, and honestly, if it weren't for that, we may not be talking about London the way we do today, so shout out to the inaugural team for delivering when it really mattered. For the worst London season of all time, let's go back to 2021, the start to the EU London era that we all know and love today. But it was anything but pretty in this first experimental year. They didn't just fail, they failed miserably. A 1-23 record is amongst one of the worst in league history. And it literally took until the very last game of the season to get that win. And it was in a map 5 against Vancouver, no less. Everybody was very excited when signing the dominant British Hurricane core, but it just didn't work out. This was, of course, before Landon and Admiral fixed the backline issues, so that part of the team was still kind of a mess. There was also no backbone, and Sparker wasn't 18 at the start of the season, and to add insult to injury, they were on ping the entire year. Hadi has gone on the record saying this team would have been middle of the pack if they actually did play on normal ping, and maybe we should take his word for it. But regardless, the hype in the new chapter of this team nearly died before it even had the chance to blossom. Thank God they pulled through in the end, am I right? The LA Gladiators. I'd say that their best one was 2022. The Glads do have a pretty long line of solid years that ended in sadness, but I'd say that 22 was probably the most enjoyable of those years. The ending was not desirable, but damn was that regular season phenomenal. They won back-to-back tournaments, becoming only the third team to ever do so. They had 3 Role Stars, 2 MVP candidates, and a pretty unbelievable team. People like Kevster and Shu were literally taking over the league. This Glads team could literally beat anybody at their peak. They showed us how fun the league can be in Overwatch 2, and for that, they hold a pretty special place in our hearts. And for their worst year, it's very obviously 2023. Up until then, the Glads had never had an actual disaster outside of like playoff collapses. Honestly, even through the first half of 23, things were looking pretty alright for them. But damn did things take a turn for the worst when Dante and Lastro effectively stepped away from the team. They lost all understanding of how to play rush comps, and they could not play Sombra to save their lives. By messing with the stuff they never should have, they lost 7 of their last 8 games of the season to miss out on the playoffs and even a chance at play-ins. The first and only time this has ever happened. Not to mention that they'd go on to have one of the worst mid-season collapses in Overwatch League history. This is just a sad way for a team to go out that's always been known for their consistency and competitiveness. Looking into little brother, so to speak, for the Valiant, I would argue their best season was their first one. We all know that the Valiant peaked during this time, as they never got any better than this. A 27-win season, a Stage 4 title, and a top 4 finish in the playoffs. They've never even come close to replicating this level of success since then, thanks to an unbelievably terrible org. But man, 2018 was definitely a time to be alive. They took the Blizzard Arena by storm with wings out chants and many very exciting matches. Granted, their peak didn't last that long, but in Stage 4, they were 1000% the team to beat. The only time we've ever truly said that about them in their history. The 2018 Valiant were the most consistent variation of the team, and I'd argue that it was the most enjoyable time and the most hopeful time as a Valiant fan. And for their worst season of all time, 2021, aka the most ratioed team of all time. They are quite arguably the worst team in the game's history, and for so many reasons. For starters, they had one of the 3 winless seasons in OWL history, and in those 16 attempts, they never even came close to winning a game. In the end, they posted a map record of 2, 48, and 1, which converts to a map win percentage of 4%. But the sad thing is, the Valiant's disastrous season expands way beyond their pitiful gameplay. Immortals chose to ditch their original roster just months before the season started, effectively screwing multiple players out of a job, and in the process, they lied to their fans in their faces and pretty much became the most hated team in the league. They couldn't even make a Twitter post without getting ratioed. And it's all cause Immortals were scumbags. They couldn't be bothered to be a part of the league. They would rather lie to your faces and be lazy than actually put in the effort. They willingly chose to soil their reputation and move to China to have one of the worst seasons ever. Just a pitiful display from an org that nobody will ever forgive them for. While we're on the topic of living in the good old days, let's talk about the NYXL. 2018 is where it was at for these guys. This is what set the franchise up for years of prosperity and fan loyalty. Despite choking in the playoffs, they still did post one of the best records ever at 34-6. They also became one of only 3 teams to ever win multiple stage titles in the same season. Not to mention, Jonak had the most dominant support season of all time en route to an MVP. Meanwhile, guys like Sae, Biobi, and Pine were capturing tons of interest for their skills and their personalities. Honestly, a lot of emphasis was put on making those New York players feel confident, but very likable with their in and out of game personalities. NYXL marketed their team very well, and I would say both in and out of the game, they were able to skyrocket to popularity. This New York team was very memorable for a lot of reasons, and for people not even a fan of the team, I'd argue that it's still one of the most nostalgic and special rosters to take a look back on. As for the time that you don't want to look back on, we're going to travel to 2022. After their first 3 seasons, New York did have a lot of letdowns, but I'd say the worst defense was definitely 22. A 4-20 record is bottom tier, one of the worst we've ever seen. But then you think about the letdown and the wasted potential of Yaki and Flora as a DPS line and how they just couldn't get it together. I mean, it practically ruined Flora's confidence until he left the team. Also, they had 0 functioning supports and a singular rookie to tank all of the responsibility. I mean, Kuki was doing such a bad job of coaching this team that he got fired and never found another job in the league. Even the org was catching crap after Myungbong found out about his release through a Twitter post. I mean, just a complete and utter fall from grace for a team that was once respected by everybody around the world. Thank God things didn't get any worse, am I right? The San Francisco Shock. Honestly, their best season is a tough choice, but for me, it's gotta be 2020. 2019 is very close behind, but I for one find the 20 championship a bit more impressive. Maybe they weren't record-breaking like the 2019 roster, but they were just as dominant, if not even more, while facing greater competition. I mean, if you include tournaments, they lost 4 games all season. They also won more stage titles than 2019, plus the grand finals on top of it. This Shock team was loaded from top to bottom with perhaps the greatest support and tank lines ever assembled. With new additions like Ans and Twilight, they were able to go from a scary team to a bona fide nightmare. They won a lot of tight games against the best teams in the league in super high pressure environments. Sometimes the 2019 squad would falter under these conditions, but in 2020, they broke past their limits, almost always remaining calm and collected and staying in control even in a tight set. This was truly a team of champions. They didn't always dominate every game, but when it came to getting it done, they always found a way. Between the consistency, the roster, and the accolades, this just might be the best team ever. As for their worst season, I'm gonna go with 2023. Maybe this is a hot take considering what happened in 2018, but I believe from a fan perspective that this year was worse. From a skill perspective, obviously not, but the worst season ever doesn't always have to do with the numbers alone. What makes the Shock's 2023 season worse is the expectations surrounding it. In the 2018 season, we knew what the Shock were trying to build. We knew they weren't a playoff team, so the expectations ultimately weren't super high. With this year's Shock, they burned with ambition. They were fresh off a grand finals appearance, Proper was at the top of his game, and now they were adding in all of his buddies from O2 Blast. The Shock were supposed to dominate in 2023 with maybe the most exciting young team ever assembled. Even if you weren't thinking championship, most people thought that play-ins were a given. What we got instead was a 500 record, no playoff berth, and not a single win against a top team. This team flopped so unimaginably hard that they made mid-season roster changes in a panic to make improvements. This team had so much hype, and they literally accomplished nothing. And considering how they managed to waste the prime of Proper and how so many other players did not play to the level we thought they would, it's pretty easy to argue that this was by far the most disappointing year to be a Shock fan. For the Seoul Dynasty, I'm gonna go with 2020 as their best season. I did for a while go back and forth between this one and the 2022 year, but in the end I picked 2020. I do think we can agree that the 22 roster was better overall, but they didn't necessarily have the better season. Yes, they did win their only tournament in franchise history, but beyond that, they found no success. The 2020 team was extremely inconsistent, hence why I was reluctant to pick them, but they did have some very exciting ups throughout the entire year to help make up for it. When it mattered, this team usually showed up, a quality the 2022 team basically didn't have, and I'd argue that makes the experience more memorable for the fans. Despite going 12-12 in the regular season, they were in the thick of it in multiple tournaments, including an improbable playoff run to the grand finals. Think about how they were competitive against Shanghai and how they shocked them in the playoffs, and speaking of the shock, they were able to take them to 6 maps in the second closest grand finals we've ever seen. This team was really clutch, and kind of in comparison to what I was talking about with Atlanta, I think the improbable run just leaves more of a long-lasting impact on the fans compared to a dominant regular season where you just don't show up in the playoffs. You don't give off that false sense of hope for fans where you play so good up until the very end when you flop. What makes the 2020 team so fun is how unexpected it was. It added an extra element of excitement for a Dynasty fan that anybody would kill to relive. Something they certainly do not want to relive though is their worst season, aka 2018. The worst part of Seoul easily comes at the very beginning. The 2018 Dynasty were supposed to be world beaters. Every analyst and journalist thought of them as immediate title favorites. I mean, they literally got their name from the Dynasty they formed in Apex before the league. Based off the team and their accomplishments, they had some of the highest expectations ever. But the domination and the trophies never came to light. The former Apex Dynasty straight up missed the playoffs this year, finishing in 8th place no less. The lights proved to be way too bright for these guys as they lost pretty much every major match of the season. They choked away multiple stage playoff opportunities while failing to beat the other Korean super teams a single time. All of those expectations to be a dynasty, and they're playing second, even third fiddle. And by stage 3, it did reach a boiling point. The players were frustrated, and the coaching had no idea what they were doing, leading to a lot of finger pointing, unnecessary roster changes in the infamous Jaehong main tank. They couldn't handle that they were underperforming, so they blamed each other instead of sticking together, which ultimately led to their demise in one of the most disappointing seasons we've ever seen. Moving on to the Seoul Infernal / Philly Fusion, I'm gonna go with 2020 as their best season. Between competitive nature and just being very memorable, 2020 was a great experience for a Fusion fan. Yeah, they had a lot of second places and they didn't make the grand finals like 2018, but they made up for it by basically being a contender the whole year. I mean, they went 24-2 in the regular season, and they had a roster that was extremely memorable. Carpe and Alarm were both in the MVP conversation. Alarm won Rookie of the Year. They had one of the best backlines, redemption arcs from Sato and Ivy, as well as a young Hisu coming into the picture. This was the strongest Philly team ever, and they were clearly a match for any team in the league. Not to mention that they were a part of arguably the greatest game ever against the Paris Eternal, and along the way they were pushing teams like Paris and the Shock to their limits, defeating them even. This Philly team had what it took, it just didn't work out in the end for them. This team was a contender right up until the end, which is not something that we can say about any other campaign from them. And on top of it all, there was just a big emotional attachment. The success, the tense matches, and the wholesome nature of Alarm, Carpe, and Poco all together just makes it something that you're always going to remember and think of very fondly, despite the shortcomings. As for their worst season, let's go with 2019. Honestly, even though they've had a lot of shortcomings, Philly fans have generally had it pretty good in terms of relevance. 2019 is the only year they ever missed the playoffs, and even then, they still managed a 15-13 record. This was about the only time they were truly forgettable, and it's mostly because they were just a mediocre GOATS team. Not even a bad one, just kinda there, you know? Definitely disappointing, yes, they just went to the grand finals 1 year prior, but compared to a lot of other teams that have had some serious meltdowns, you can't get all that mad, you know? If a play-in match is the worst you have to offer in your history, you did pretty good. Next up, the Shanghai Dragons. Obviously, for their best season, it's 2021. 2021 wasn't just peak Shanghai, but honestly, peak Overwatch. Shanghai pulled off the ultimate redemption, from 0-40 to league champions. And in that run, they dominated harder than arguably any other champion we've seen. I mean, nobody even stood a chance. Beyond that, they also had the best record in the league in 2 stage championships. Given the success and how insane this roster was, 2021 Shanghai is arguably the best team in Overwatch League history. I mean, they had Fleta, Lip, and Void at their peaks. It was probably the most complete starting 6 I've ever seen, and their unbeatable Ball Sombra comp put them in a league all by themselves. This Shanghai team was absolutely brilliant, and they truly were an all-time great. But along with one of the biggest high points in league history, they have arguably the biggest low point with their 2018 campaign. One of the most infamous seasons in the history of esports. The 2018 Dragons lost 40 consecutive games, and in a lot of those matches, it was not close. Despite the crowd cheering them on time after time, they could never put 2 and 2 together. This team truly was dysfunctional at every level. It goes beyond the gameplay. It never felt like the whole team was in sync, that much is obvious, but the org itself was also full of controversy, corruption, tampering, player allegations, and the coaches supposedly forcing this team to practice 15 hours a day, even on game day. I mean, this team really was a disaster. It's one of the worst ran teams in league history. While this team definitely does mark how far Shanghai has come compared to the present, at the time, it was a really horrible experience, and it's something that I think we'd all prefer to leave behind forever, as we only think about the good stuff that happened in the years after. As for the Toronto Defiant, for their best season, I'm gonna go with 2022. Toronto Defiant truly never had that season with that wow factor, you know? This was basically the closest they ever got. Led by Twilight and Hisu, the Toronto Defiant were able to go 12-12 and make the playoffs legitimately for the only time in franchise history. Not to mention that Toronto had a top 3 finish in the Summer Showdown tournament in front of their home crowd, which was their highest placement of all time. Sad as it is, that's peak Toronto for you. They had star players, a few exciting ups, and perhaps their only good season, or one that you could even consider slightly above average. Toronto's got a long line of sad history, so a little dub like this is pretty good for them, and you have to take it. For the worst season in Toronto's history, there's a lot of competitors for sure, but I'd say the worst offense is 2019. At 8-20, they were far below mid. Funny thing is, it didn't start out that way for them. They were initially a pretty respectable team, even managing a 5-2 record in the first stage and making the playoffs. But after that, everything fell apart. Envy was a toxic teammate, Stellar left after stage 1, and their GOATS play took a nosedive. And by the end of stage 2, they basically gave up on going full Korean, and they signed a bunch of Western players mid-season, which honestly only caused more confusion. With each stage, their level of play only got worse. The rest of the way through, after the first stage, they won only 3 games. That's over a 5-month span. Just a brutal collapse where the org clearly had no idea what they were doing. This 2019 Defiant team might go down as one of the worst teams I've ever seen at responding to adversity. As for their Canadian counterparts, with Vancouver, it's very obviously 2019 taking home the best season. We all know the story. Runaways Overwatch League takeover. Vancouver were one of the most anticipated teams to ever touch the stage, and right from day one, they were able to deliver. They were a top 2 team all season and one of the greatest GOATS teams in the history of the game. They won the Stage 1 finals, they made the Stage 2 finals, and they made the Grand Finals. They had the top record in the league at 25-3. They had the Rookie of the Year Hangzhou, plus Twilight as well, who was in contention for the MVP, and they just took the league by storm. Everybody had their eyes on the Vancouver Titans. The Runaway fans loved them, and all the people villainizing them made them one of the most interesting teams in the league's history. This team was widely successful in all facets, and you really can't draw up a better start to your existence if you tried. But just a few years later, they'd have their worst season. That's gonna be 2021. This is ultimately the more depressing season to me compared to like 2020. Disastrous as that time was, at least they were still winning games from time to time. That implosion was absolutely horrible, but they showed some fight, you know? 2021 Vancouver was basically this lifeless husk of a team. At 1-15, with only 10 map wins, they posted one of the worst seasons of all time, with their only real personality being a Pizza Hut breadsticks meme. The only way to even tempt spectators to cheer them on was in hopes of some cheap pizza chain breadsticks, a promotion that, mind you, took them 4 months to cash in on. That's the biggest storyline of their season. Now granted, I'll give them credit, it was a genius marketing strategy, but it was more so about the breadsticks and not the players. 2021 may not have had the heartbreak of 2020, but this team was borderline unwatchable. At least the year prior, they had like Shockwave, you know? This team was just boring. End of story. Looking into the Vegas/Paris Eternal, their best season is very easily 2020. It's the only good one they've ever had. In 2020, Paris were genuinely a fun team to watch, with perhaps the most exciting young prospect of the time in Sparkle leading the way alongside multiple Element Mystic teammates. Paris were actually a force. They immediately showed they were league ready in year 1 with a 19-6 record, the only time they've ever been above 500. Along the way, they beat some really good teams, and they went on that famous Summer Showdown Championship run in one of the most exciting tournaments we've ever seen. It's the only time they've been remotely successful in their lifetime, and it's not particularly close. Paris did a lot to establish themselves this year, but unfortunately, it was nothing more than lightning in a bottle. As for their worst season, definitely 2023. This one's fresh in our memory. The 2023 Eternal had arguably the worst season we've ever seen. They're one of the 3 teams to go winless in a season, and their map win percentage was less than 10%. This team was absolutely pitiful, with multiple starters being arguably the worst at their position and refusing to make any changes during the offseason. Not to mention that within the org was a toxic environment. Many of the players were not treated well, and Avala was consistently getting exposed for selfish decision making and making players look bad by both former and current employees. The 2023 Vegas Eternal were terrible in every facet, and it'll go down as one of the biggest disgraces and most poorly ran franchises in the history of Overwatch. And lastly, team number 20, the Washington Justice. For them, I'm going to go with 2021 as their best year. The Justice, like others, do not have a lot of success stories, and I think 2020, while it was the closest thing to a playoff run they've had, it just wasn't as enjoyable of a time overall compared to 2021. In 2021, they were at least somewhat legit and somewhat consistent, and they had an above 500 record at 9-7, and they even made good rivals for the Gladiators and Dallas Fuel at times, alongside that huge play-in victory against the Outlaws. This was the first year building around Decay and of course Mag, and everybody was pretty hyped. While we expected them to be a little bit better, they were still in the headlines for a lot of good reasons rather than the usual bad, while staying relatively consistent across the year. And just given their history and knowing what else they've done, this is about the only time we could ever say such a thing, and for me at least, it was probably the most enjoyable time to watch them over a long stretch of time. For their worst season ever, I'm going with 2019. Now, if the playoff run never happened, this would have been 2020, but the fact is the 2019 Justice had no playoff run, and they were equally as bad, if not worse, during the regular season. They were probably one of the worst GOATS teams we've ever seen. Watching them genuinely hurt. And the worst part about it all is that this was all self-inflicted. This team was designed for a future beyond GOATS. Wizard Young built this team entirely based on luck and that the expectation that GOATS would not last. But guess what? That backfired, because as it turns out, Blizzard is terrible at balancing their game. GOATS ends up lasting for a majority of the season, the Justice win 2 games during the GOATS span, and they're out of the playoffs by the end of Stage 3. The only good part of their season, which was able to get them to the 8-win mark, came in Stage 4 when they went 6-1. The problem is, these games were absolutely meaningless. It was basically just for pride and to have something to look forward to next year. And given this is a professional league, pride is only going to get you so far when you have a bunch of angry fans who are mad at you for sucking. The Justice were highly unfun for like 80% of the season, and they accomplished nothing of value. The Corey and Stratus storyline was great, but that only takes you so far. Now, if things were different, the 2019 Justice maybe could have been one of the biggest what-ifs we've ever seen, but sadly, that's just not the reality we live in, and this is ultimately one of the worst seasons of all time. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is gonna mark the end of the video. Let me know what you're thinking. Do you remember some of these seasons more than the others? Which ones really hit home the most, and what would you have changed if you were the one making this list? Let me know all your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, and you want more Overwatch esports content every single week, make sure to give this video a big fat thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel if you're new. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.